I came across this incredible book. It claims to be a record of what took place over the course of some short period of time, a day or a few days or a couple of months, 3,460 years ago. It appears that this book was published in the form that I'm going to read it to you about 2,800 years ago. And we know for an absolute fact that this book is at least 2,000 years old. We have copies of this book that are over 2,000 years old. And there's a group of people who have taken this book incredibly seriously, more seriously than anyone else in the world. A small little group of people. And that small little group of people is the Jews. There's only out of every 5 or 6 or 700 people in the world, there's just one Jew. Out of out of every 600 people on earth, there's one Jewish person. And the numbers have pretty much always been, that the Jews have been a tiny, tiny people. And they've been taking this book seriously for thousands and thousands of years. So I'll read to you here because I understand the Hebrew more or less. I'll do my best at reading to you this book. And it's just something worth knowing about. It's unbelievably fascinating. You probably know a little bit about the story of Moses in the Bible, where Moses takes the Jews out of Egypt, where there are slaves and stuff like that, and then he leads them to the desert. Well, supposedly this book takes place at the very end of his life. That's what the introduction says anyway. And like I said, the introduction appears, based on a lot of convincing evidence, to be around 2,800 years old. And, and also a few verses scattered throughout, a few sentences here and there, just seem to be made to explain things, because 700 years had passed, so to explain things to that audience of that day. But since then, for 2,800 years, nothing. So I'm going to do my best here to try to translate it. Here's the introduction. Eila hadvorim asher diber Moshe. So what I'll do is, because some of you do know Hebrew, I'll read a paragraph in Hebrew, and then I'll go through it again with Hebrew and English translation. But it's worth hearing it, even if you don't know Hebrew, it's worth hearing it in the cadence, how it actually sounds in the original language. Because there's nothing quite like the original. Ele hadvarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael be'ever hayarden, bamidbar, ba'arava, mor suf, ben paran uben tofel, ולבן וחצרות ודזהב. 11 יום מחורב, דרך הר שעיר עד קדש פניה. ויהי ב40 שנה, ב12 חודש, באחד החודש, דיבר משה על בני ישראל, ככל אשר ציווה יהוה עושו עליהם. אחרי הכוסו את סיחון מלך האמורי, אשר יושב בחשבון, ואת אוג מלך הבשן, אשר יושב בעשתרות באדרי. בעבר הירדן, בארץ מואב, הואיל משה ביאר את התורה הזאת לאמור. Now I'll say it for you with the Hebrew and English, so you can get the original words, regardless of your level of Hebraic knowledge or of biblical knowledge, which is pretty essential to this. You ever see some old book that has numerous prefaces? On the there's a second preface, an introduction to the second edition, and an introduction to the 5th edition, the 50th edition, right? So it's kind of layered, where the main core of the text that was published originally in 1910 or whatever, comprises the majority of the book. Right before that, you have the preface that was put in 1910, and then before that, you have the preface from the second edition, and before that from the 5th edition, before that from the 50th edition. I've seen quite a few old books that literally have 5 prefaces. So this here appears to have 2 or 3, introductory sentences, and then they added on a sentence earlier because maybe 100 years had passed or something like that. It's not entirely clear exactly which part is original. It's not even clear if it's actually supposed to be quotes. It's going to have a story about Moses talking with the Jews and God speaking and stuff like that, and Moses conveying. It's interesting. It's fascinating stuff. And but you find that it seems earlier, in the Bible that you might be familiar with, where the Jews receive the manna, they call it the manna, the magical food that comes from the heavens in the desert. They call it manna because in Aramaic it says there in the Bible that they said manhu. What is it? So mana. That's why it is in English and Hebrew man. So it seems the Jews might not have spoken Hebrew, and this might be a Hebrew translation of it, but I'm really not sure. Okay. So to read that original paragraph to you again. Eila hadvarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael. These are the words that Moses said to all of Israel. Be'ever hayarden, on the other side of the Jordan River. In other words, according to the story of the Bible, the Jews left Egypt when after the 10 plagues, and then they crossed the Reed Sea. They went through the Sinai Desert. They received the Torah in the Sinai Desert. And then they wandered for 40 years going up through Jordan, through what today is the country of Jordan, which until literally about 70 years ago, was called Transjordan, meaning the other side of the Jordan, based on the biblical centrality of Israel on the west bank of the Jordan River, going all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. If you're familiar with the map of the Middle East, Israel borders the Mediterranean Sea. South of Israel, you'll have Egypt. North of Israel, you'll have Lebanon and Syria. To the right, you have Jordan. So Ever HaYarden, the other side of the Jordan, is where the Jews were traveling, and before they crossed, because apparently Moses did not actually cross into the land of Israel. So just to know the name Moses, where that comes from, and the name Israel, you know what, we don't really have that much time, so I'll just read over here, go on. These are the words that Moses said to all of Israel. Israel means the Jewish people. Be'ever HaYarden, on the other side of the Jordan River, Bamidbar, in the desert, Ba'arava, on the plains, technically in Arabia, Mol Suf, near the reeds, Ben Paran, Ben Tofel, V'Lavan, V'Chatzerot, V'Dizahav, between Paran and Tofel and Lavan, Chatzerot and Dizahav. These are locations that were known in ancient times, and I think that archaeologists have actually discovered a number of them, and we can say with some level of certitude where some of these places are. So it seems, it has the verisimilitude of not getting locations anyway too wrong as far as we can tell. And it goes on to give more directions, more instructions of where this took place. It's 11 days between Chorev and Kadesh Barnea if you're going through Mount Seir way. So again, if you're in the Middle East, you can have tour guides in Israel and Jordan pointing out to you where this area is. But for now, it's just, it really does add to the believability of a lot of this. And it wasn't the 40th year, which I'm assuming means the 40th year after the Jews left Egypt and received the Ten Commandments and the divine revelation at Sinai. And Chorev is another name for Sinai, by the way. So, and it was in the 40th year, in the 11th month, in the first day of the 11th month. So according to the Jewish calendar, that would be the first day of the month of Adar, because the very first month, of course, is what we call Nisan, or you might call Chodesh HaAviv in the Bible. So it was in the 40th year, on the 11th month, the first day of the month, that Moses spoke to the sons of Israel. Israel was another name for Jacob. Basically, Jacob was one of the patriarchs of the Jewish people. You have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob was kind of a mama's boy, and he had to come into his own. He had to start defending himself, taking care of himself. And when he does that successfully, he gets the name Yisrael, which means wrestles with God, or goes straight with God, or wins over God. So the Jews later on came to be known not as Jacobins, not as Jacobites, but as Israel, which they're still known as today. Actually, the name of the country in the Middle East is Israel. So it was then that Moses spoke to the sons of Israel, to the children of Israel, everything that Yahweh commanded him regarding them. Yahweh is the four-letter name of God, Yud He Vav He in Hebrew. And just to explain one minor little thing is that some people don't want me to say necessarily the word Yahweh. So let me just explain very clearly that according to Jewish law, whether you should or shouldn't say it, I don't know how to pronounce it, because theoretically, supposedly, nobody knows how to pronounce it. But it really goes much deeper than that. Ultimately, at the end of the day, there's no such thing as magic sounds, except in the hearts of people. So we have to address things the way they are today. This name, Yahweh, for God, is extraordinarily fascinating in many, many ways, but, not for right now. And then it goes on to say, so when did this take place? And again, this is the part where I think the original preface took place, when it was originally published, maybe 3,000 years ago, before the final version was around 2800 or something like that, maybe even a little later. People just a few hundred years after the fact might have just required this part. After he smote Sichon, the king of the Amorites, who lived in Cheshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtarot in Edrei, on the other side of the Jordan, right, in Transjordan, in the country that today we call Jordan. In other words, the Jordan River, Transjordan, the other side of the Jordan River. Be'ever HaYarden, Be'eretz Moab, in the other side of the Jordan, in the land of Moab, which is what it continued to be called for a very, very, very long time. Ho'il Moshe Be'er et HaTorah Hazot Lemor. Moses undertook to give an explication of this Torah, this instructions. That's what Torah literally means. And following, you have Moses' instructions. One thing that we know for sure about this book is that it was considered part of the Jewish Bible. In fact, it was considered the fifth book of the first 5 books of Moses, already before Christianity existed. Before there was any Islam, before there was any Christianity. Literally, there are copies that were dug up only a few years ago that we know for a fact archaeologically were written and buried hundreds of years before Jesus was born. So this was something when the Jews were not, well known around the globe. This was already considered by them to be authoritative. So whenever it was actually put into the form that we have today, this form that I'm looking at on the internet right now, the exact form, because I'm saying I've actually checked this, not every single word, but enough to know that I can trust it. I've checked this internet version over here against the actual Torah scrolls that are used in synagogues. So I'm saying this is really legitimately what it is. Like I said, I don't think that this book would deny that the Jews didn't speak Hebrew precisely the way it was written. I think they're clear that it's a translation, at least in part, a translation into Hebrew from a few hundred years later, but they do seem to be trying to give over pretty much what they think more or less was exactly what Moses had said. So if there's some truth to this, it's pretty incredible. I'll read that again. Eila hadvarim is what the book claims. These are the words, Asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael, that Moses said to all of Israel, be'ever hayarden, on the other side of the Jordan, before we came into the land of Israel, ba'midbar, in the desert, ba'arava, on the plains, mulsuf, near the reeds, bein Paran uvein Tofel, between Paran and Tofel, v'Lavan v'chatzeros v'dizahav, in the area of Lavan, Chatzeros, and Dizahav. Achadas yom Chorev, an 11 days journey from Chorev, derech har Seir ad Kodesh Barnea, through the path called the Mount Seir path, until you get to a city called Kodesh Barnea. Vayhi ba'arbayim shana, it was in the 40th year, in other words, the 40th year from when the Jews left Egypt. So Vayhi ba'arbayim shana, it was in the 40th year, ba'ashir asa chodesh, in the 11th month, that's what we today would call the month of Adar, but it wasn't called that back in ancient times. I mean, Jews have been calling it Adar for approximately 2,700 years, but as you can see this, which purports to go back 3,500 years, or at least Moses is speaking 3,460 years ago, telling us what supposedly happened 40 years prior to that. Wild stuff. Vayhi ba'arbayim shana, it was in the 40th year, ba'ashir asa chodesh, in the 11th month, be'echel chodesh, in the first day of the month, that diber Moshe b'nei Yisrael, Moses spoke to the sons of Israel, k'chol asher tziva Yahweh oso aleim, in accordance with everything that Yahweh commanded him regarding to them. Acharei hikoso Sichon melech Amori, after he smote Sichon the king of the Amorites, asher yoshev b'Cheshbon, who lived in Cheshbon, ve'es Og melech Bashan, and Og the king of Bashan, asher yoshev ba'Ashtaros be'Edrei, who dwelt in Ashtaros and Edrei. Be'ever hayarden be'eretz Moav, it was across the Jordan River, in other words, what today we call the country of Jordan. What until about 70 years it was called Transjordan. Be'ever hayarden, it was in Transjordan, be'eretz Moav, in the land of Moab. Hoil Moshe be'er as Torah hazos, that Moses undertook upon himself to explain this instructions. Lamar saying, quote, Yahweh Eloheinu diber aleinu b'chorev. Yahweh our God spoke to us at Chorev. Chorev is Mount Sinai. Lamar saying, quote, Rav lochem sheves bahar hazeh. Enough of you sitting at this mountain. It makes sense that this is where the Jews had this revelation. You can just imagine the slave people after 430 years of slavery. They had some belief in the ancient promises of forefathers hundreds of years prior, and it ended up manifesting through God, through the Tao, whatever it is, assuming the story has some truth to it, but nonetheless, from this perspective, it does. It ends up manifesting into this, God saying, not only aren't you slaves, but you're supposed to be the chosen people, and to have this spot in the world that's exactly at the crux of the world, the crux of the entire world. It's the Bereket Hilal, the Fertile Crescent, going from Babylon up through southern Syria and southern Turkey, down through Lebanon into Israel, then through the Nile, and from Israel also out to the entire Mediterranean Sea. And God reveals himself to them himself and gives them instructions. Must have been the most shocking thing that anyone could possibly imagine, if there's anything to this. So the Jews obviously figured, this is the safest place to be, stick around near this mountain. But God, being a good parent, wants independence. God wants people to be independent, which is really, really something. So God says, Rav lachem sheves bahar hazeh, enough of you sitting around this hill. Penu, turn, u'sa'u lachem, and start traveling for yourselves. U'vo'u har ha'amori, and come with me to the Mount of the Amorites, Vel kol shchenav, and to all his neighbors, Ba'arava in Arabia, Vahar in the hills, Uvashvela in the low points, Uvanegev, and in the Negev region, the dry regions, Uvachof hayam, and at the seacoast, Eretz Aknani, the land of the Canaanites, V'halavonon and Lebanon, Ad ha-Nahar Hagadol, Nahar Prus, until the great river, the Parthian river, which we know in English as the Euphrates River. Re'eh, behold, Moses is saying, this is what God said to me to tell you 40 years ago, this is what I said to you. I said to you in God's name, Re'eh, behold, Nasati lefnechem es haaretz, I placed before you this land, Bo, come, because God's already there, because God's everywhere, because God isn't physical, which is something well worth discussing. Bo, come, u'reshu, and inherit it, es haaretz, this land, Hashem nishba Yahweh avosechem, that Yahweh promised to your forefathers, Avraham, to Abraham, Yitzchak, and to Isaac, Yaakov, and to Jacob, Lases lahem, to give to them, Zaram acharehem, and to their seed after them. Va'omer alechem ba'esahi, and I said to you at that time. Now this is a little bit sad because over here Moses is starting to give an implied confession about how, I'm sorry guys, we both suffered because I was not the ideal father of a people that I could possibly be. The task put upon Moses, if there's any truth to this story, is larger than any task that I could imagine in history. So no offense to him at all whatsoever, but nonetheless, he's saying that an absolute ideal father of the people, would have absolute patience with them and would love his involvement with them to help them out and wouldn't see it as a bother, It's a little bit sad because Moses was the greatest that there was, quite obviously, according to the Jewish viewpoint. I mean, these are called the 5 books of Moses, even though the very first of the books doesn't even mention him at all. Va'omer alechem ba'esahi, and I said to you at that time, Lemor, quote, Lo uchal levad yisa'es eschem, I can't carry you alone. Yahweh Elohechem hir ba'eschem, Yahweh your God made you multiply. V'hinchem hayom kechofei hashamayim larov, and behold, today you are as many as the stars of the heavens. And Yahweh Elohei Avosechem Yosef Alechem, may Yahweh, the God of your fathers, increase upon yourselves. Kechem, like this, elef pam, 1,000 times as many. V'yivorech eschem, may he bless you kasher dibalachem, like he said to you. But Eicha, Esa, Levadi, Tarchechem, Umaschem, Virivchem, how can I possibly carry your burdens, your weights, and your arguments? Havu lechem anoshim, bring from yourselves men, Chachomim, who are smart, Unavonim, and have insight, V'yeduim l'shiftechem, and are known and trusted within your particular tribe, because there were 12 tribes of Israel at that time, according to this text. Havu lechem anoshim, Chachomim, Unavonim, V'yeduim. Bring for yourselves men who are smart and deep and trusted, l'shiftechem, for your tribes, v'asimim b'roshechem, and I will place them officially at your heads. V'ratanu osi, and you answered me, v'atomru, and you said, Tov hadovar, it's okay this matter, asher dibarta la'asos, that you've planned to do, that you want to do. In other words, the Jews are accepting it, but they're a little disappointed in Moses and in themselves, just like Moses is a little bit disappointed in himself and in them. And they say, it's okay, sure, It's the way it says, they answered and they said, right? In other words, it wasn't legitimately a truest answer. Tov hadavar, it's okay this matter, asher dibarta la'asos, that you have said already priorly to do. Vo'ekach es roshei shiftechem, and I took these heads of your tribes, anashim chachamim, smart men, v'yeduim, and trusted. Interestingly, the terms, before he asked for nevonim also, those that have bina, those that have an intuition for what's right. For example, within Jewish texts, you'll often find bina associated more with the feminine sort of knowledge that isn't quite as easily put into words because it's more holistic, coming from a much broader array of little bits of information instead of tons of information from one area, which is more what men are into, more very focused. So there might be some sort of feminist take on this over here, that, or perhaps anti-feminist take, that originally they were thinking as well, maybe there are some women fit for the job, but it didn't go, and they couldn't make that work. It's one reading. I'm not saying it's necessarily correct whatsoever, but it is interesting that just a verse later, you find that he says, I took them. Rosh Hashiftechem, these heads of your tribes, Anoshim Chachamim, smart men, V'yeduim, and well-known and trusted, but the Nevonim part is missing. Anyway, Va'etenos Rosh Alechem, I placed them as heads upon you, Sorei Alofim, V'sorei Meos, V'sorei Chamishim, V'sorei Asoros, as heads of thousands, and heads of hundreds, and heads of 50, and heads of tens. In other words, an hierarchical system. And because of all this, we needed also police. Because the ideal in this book is very much about a true connection between yourself and your God, as God is inside of you. And it shouldn't be something that's coming from outside. It shouldn't have to go through a misunderstood hierarchy. It shouldn't even have to go through Moses, is the ideal in the Revelation, as we're going to see when we read a little further. But certainly not to go through these many, many levels. And so you see now they needed police. This very first generation that received the law was having difficulty. They were the ones who said it. We owe them everything in terms of passing on Jewish law. It wouldn't exist if not for how much they revered it. But nonetheless, they had quite a difficult time with it. And I commanded your judges at that time, saying, in other words, this is Moses giving them their oath of office, kind of. It's his instructions to them. In other words, they're independent, which is how rabbinic ordination is supposed to work as well. Obviously, there are some places that are trying to make it different, but that's not what real rabbinic ordination is. Real rabbinic ordination is ha'emidu talmidim harbe. You stand up the other person. You give the other person independence. You give them your ethical instructions and all the rest. And now at this point, it's for them. Torah lo b'shamayim. Torah isn't in the heavens. It's not me'ever layam. It's not in someone else's hands. It's beficha uvavavcha. So, that's what rabbinical ordination is supposed to be as well in its ideal form. That you're saying, I trust this guy. I'm putting my name to this guy. And yeah, he might end up disagreeing in some respects, but it's coming from his ability. I know his heart. I know from which he speaks, from where he speaks. So you find that these people have absolute responsibility to themselves. And Moses is just someone higher up on the hierarchy. But Moses trusts that they'll actually follow through on the instructions that he gives them, or at least he hopes so. He says, and I commanded your judges at that time, 40 years prior, Lamor saying, pay attention when there's something going on among your brothers that's unpleasant, people who are not getting along with each other. And judge righteously, and judge righteously between a man and his brother and a dweller. Really, because Israel was very central in terms of for trade of ideas and products and everything through this country, that which is why they have origin stories in Egypt and in Mesopotamia as to how they ended up in Israel. It's understood that you're going to have a lot of people living within the land of Israel who are travelers, who are joining the people, officially, non-officially, whatever it might be. It's, changed from time to time, obviously. But, we find intermarriage between other peoples all throughout the Bible, very, very, very commonly. Sometimes it's problematic, sometimes it's not problematic. It really depends on whether these people end up joining and adopting the culture and belief system of the ideal Jewish beliefs or not. That's really what it comes down to usually. In any case, so he's saying judge righteously here between a man and his brother, and the same as between a man and his brother, between someone and someone who's dwelling there, a ger. Today in Hebrew, ger means convert, but we're not referring to someone necessarily who undergoes a whole bunch of specific things that we do today. It's a complicated subject as to how conversion worked over the course of thousands of years and exactly what it's talking about here, but it's referring to someone who lives there in the land, even if they're not from the sons of Israel. You have to judge them as righteously as between one man and his brother. Lo yisakiru panam hamishpat. Don't recognize faces in justice, right? I mean, not just don't be racist or something like that, but well beyond that. Something which in our system in America, we don't have whatsoever. In our system in America, it's a bad system. It's a really, really, really bad system. It's the best justice that money can buy. It's problematic. In our system in America, it's totally understood that you're supposed to make a good impression on the judge by wearing certain clothes, by being polite, and that if you're not polite, the judge is going to get you, and that's totally fine. Over here it says, don't even recognize faces in justice, which Jews later on interpreted to mean that actually if you're really close to the individual, whether it's relationship-wise, by family or otherwise, you're supposed to recuse yourself. You're not even allowed to be a judge. Moses is instructing them, their ideal is not only shouldn't you recognize faces, but kakaton kagadol tishmoon. Pay as much attention to the smallest, most insignificant person there as you would to the most important benefactor of the city. The biggest, literally kagadol. Kakaton, like the smallest to the biggest. In other words, it doesn't even have to give the adjectives. I'm throwing the adjectives into the translation, but it's just like saying, the smallest to the biggest. You have to treat the least individual as importantly as you would treat the most important individual to the city. Pure equality among humans. An amazing, amazing concept. So, and again, this definitively goes back at least 2,800 years. Whether it goes back an additional 600 years and actually relates what took place then is open to interpretation, but it does seem that it goes back at least a few hundred years prior to that. So, and that it was taken really seriously by Jews through a long portion of time. Anyway, but again, also that it was probably translated into this version of Hebrew. So, lo yisakiru panim hamishpat. Don't recognize faces in justice. Kakaton kagadol. Equality between the smallest and the biggest. Tishma'un, you should pay attention. Lo yisaguru mipnei ish. Don't be afraid of any man. Ki hamishpat le'elohim hu. Because justice is for Elohim. In other words, you are in loco deus. You are standing in God's, you are representing God. As justice on earth, you are representing God. You are giving people the idea of what divine justice is. You are carrying out God's will here on earth. It's huge. It applies to all of us, for the record, but especially in any kind of system of authority. And something that's too hard for you, Moses says, takrivun elai, that you can bring to me, ushma'ativ, and I'll hear it. But you can see that Moses is willing to give everything. As a matter of fact, at one point early on in the Bible, Moses actually tells God that it's too much. God, please kill me because I can't handle this. Moses was as great a leader of his people as you could possibly imagine anybody being. But apparently there's a level beyond it. The level of loving, uplifting everybody else, and entirely trusting that just being yourself in this respect, without looking out for yourself in any way, ends up leading to ultimate success for all people, including yourself. It's a hard thing to do because unless you really get there to the Jedi level, to the one with God level, it's dangerous to do. To sacrifice some required focus on yourself in order to do for others. But in any case, and I commanded you at that time all the matters that you should do. In other words, referencing probably earlier stuff in the Bible about all different other kinds of laws. And we traveled from Chorev, which is Mount Sinai, and we traversed the entire desert, this entire great and terrible desert. Nora is a hard word to translate. It doesn't exactly mean terrible like bad, but between terrible and awesome and terrifying, just like shocking desert. Asher Isam, that you saw, Derech Hare Hamori, by way of the path of the Amorite hills, Kasher Tziva Yahweh Eloheinu Osanu, in accordance with what Yahweh our God commanded us. We took the path exactly that God says. Moses is saying that he trusts that he was literally channeling God, which is unbelievable. And we got into Kadesh Barnea. And I said to you, you came into the mountains of the Amorites that Yahweh our God is giving to you, or to us, really. Behold, God is, it's interesting, before he was saying us. And I said to you, Bosem, you have come, Adhar HaAmori, to the mountain of the Amorites, Asher Yahweh Eloheinu, that Yahweh our God, Nosein Lonu, is giving to us. Re'ei Nosan Yahweh Elohecha lefanecha. Behold, Yahweh your God is placed before you as Haaretz the land. Alei, go up. Reish, inherit. Ka'asher diber Yahweh Elohei v'sechalach. In accordance with the word that Yahweh, the God of your fathers, right? He's our God, your God, the God of our fathers. Al tira, don't be afraid. Al techas, and don't turn back. Don't even think of turning back. Don't even think of any kind of focus on yourself and your own concern. Be a berserker. We're going to pause here. This was the beginning of the book of Moses, the book that this book itself calls itself Mishnah Torah, secondary to the Torah, or a revision, another version of the Torah. This book here, by the way, this fifth book, the first four books of the Bible. Well, the first one begins in the beginning, because you can't have anything before that, so it doesn't say and in the beginning. It says in the beginning. That's where it starts. And then the second book says Ve'ela Shmos, and these are the names. It's obviously the second book, the book of Exodus, is obviously a continuation from Genesis. And then Vayikra, Leviticus, Vayikra, and he called. Also, obviously, a continuation. And the fourth book of the Pentateuch, of the 5 books of Moses, the fourth book, which is called in English Numbers, it's Bamidbar in Hebrew, but it actually begins Vayedaber Yahweh el Moshe b'Midbar Sinai, and Yahweh said to Moses in the Sinai desert. So it's also an and. It begins with an and. It's obviously a continuation. Only this book does not start that way. It says Eila Hadvarim. These are the words that Moses spoke to all of Israel in the desert at the end of his life. So it doesn't have the end at the very start of it. So in its final version, this was clearly a second book, what they call a Mishnah Torah. In any case, this is pretty wild stuff to contemplate.